Good afternoon, everyone. It's very much a pleasure to be with you all today. I understand, as Danny mentioned, I am the grand finale, the last session. So I'm going to go ahead and move into what we're going to talk about today. I understand also that there are several different states on the webinar today, some federal government as well as local government, and as I mentioned, representatives from different states. So the content of my presentation is primarily going to focus on Virginia. As Danny mentioned, I do represent the Virginia Auditor of Public Accounts. My next slide, I'll kind of get into just a quick overview of what our office does. So primarily, we're going to talk about kind of what our oversight is as a state agency as it relates to Virginia local governments. So we'll talk through some various reporting requirements, as well as specific information that relates to local government audits, as well as financial information that's reported to our office for a report that we compile of all local governments. And then just kind of talk through some various topics that relate to fiscal year 23 reporting throughout local governments. We'll talk a little bit about what our office does with a quality control review process over localities audits, because we do not perform those audits. So we do a quality control review process over those external CPA firms like Cherry Beckert that perform local government audits. And then I'll end with an overview on a monitoring process that our office has been charged with, where we monitor for locality potential fiscal distress. Kind of give you a quick overview of what that process is. It has been ongoing for many years now, and then kind of where we are currently in our process, as it is an annual process that we perform. So getting started, first off, as I mentioned, just to give a quick overview, I suspect that there are many people on the call today that are not familiar with our office. So just a quick overview of who we are and what we do. So as I mentioned, we are a state agency in Virginia. We are structured under the legislative branch. So we are the independent legislative auditor for the Commonwealth of Virginia, which means primarily the bulk of the work that we do, the audit work that we do, is to support our audit opinion that we give over the Commonwealth's financial report, financial statements, as well as the single audit of federal funds that we do. So lots of different audits roll into this, huge audit. As if you are representative on a state, if you're familiar, if you're an auditor, you're probably familiar with how comprehensive that audit can be, not only on the state level, but also on a lot of local government levels as well. There can be some really large local government annual financial reports, as well as single audits. So primarily the work we do, as I mentioned, is to support the audit work over state agencies and higher ed institutions throughout Virginia. We also do a variety of different projects, special projects throughout the year. We report to a legislative agency called JLARC. So oftentimes JLARC might request specific audits or reviews of that our office performs. And then lastly, as I mentioned, we do not actually perform the audits, the financial audits over local governments. So those are all contracted out separately. Each locality or local government, whether it be another entity that's not a city, county, or a town in Virginia, have requirements to contract separately for those audits. We do a small piece over constitutional officers that handle only state funds. So anything that relates to local funds is all contracted underneath their separate external audit with a CPA firm. And then the other bulk of the work that our audit does is over the judicial entities like the courts. So again, as I mentioned earlier, what I'm going to speak to the majority of today has to do with the oversight and monitoring our office is charged with as it relates to Virginia local governments. And this slide just gives you a quick overview of kind of how we're structured at the top as far as our auditor, Stacy Henshaw, and then she has two deputies under her, Latoya Jordan and Eric Sandridge. And Stacy was appointed back in February 2021 after the prior auditor, Martha Mavridis, retired. So Stacy has been serving in this role since then. She also served for a while as a deputy auditor, and she's been with our office for, I believe it's over 25 years. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start with a poll question. So what are you hoping to learn from today's APA session? Are you hoping to get some updates about 2023 audit and financial reporting information? You're just here for the CPE, which I completely understand. Or maybe you're just hoping to get some information kind of overall about what our oversight process is for Virginia local governments. So we're going to give you some time to answer this poll question so that everybody has the opportunity. And then Danny will close out the poll when he's ready to do so. So make sure you guys answer this for your CPE. Also, one thing to mention as we're answering this poll, along the way, if you have any questions, please feel free to post those in the Q&A. And, you know, if I'll try to look at them throughout and to see if I can answer them along the way, or we'll hopefully have some time at the end where I can address some questions. So definitely feel free to use the Q&A function for that. It's also a good way to record the questions so that if I'm not able to answer them, Maddie can always send those to me later and I can reach out to everyone. All right, so we got a mix of what everyone was hoping to get out of today's sessions. All right, moving forward. So to start off, as we talk about the oversight that our office has for Virginia local governments, this kind of just gives a quick overview of the primary reporting requirements that Virginia's cities, counties, and certain towns have as it relates to our oversight and the reporting structure with our office. Obviously, these are not the only reporting requirements. There are many, many more, but this is what centers around financial reporting and the audit requirements. So these two code sections of Virginia, which if you are a Virginia local government on the webinar today, you're very familiar with this information, but it lays out audit requirements specific to all cities and counties. So that's 38 cities and 95 counties in the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia. And then certain towns that have either over a 3,500 population, or if you have a separate school system. So we do have 2 towns in Virginia where that comes into play. They are also required by state statute to have an annual audit. We'll talk a little bit in the next couple of slides about some other towns that kind of fall under audit requirements and how that is laid out. But any town that's under a 3,500 population, they are not required by state statute to have any type of audit or any type of really, review, agreed upon procedures, anything. They can elect not to, although many do voluntarily elect to have an audit, which is always good. And so this code section also speaks to if a town under this population does voluntarily have an audit, to also send those audit reports to our office. And we'll talk about that a little bit further. Just some other key reporting requirements that this slide speaks to is that those localities that fall under the annual audit requirement are required to submit their audit reports, as well as certain financial data that we use, which I'll talk about that a little bit later, that we use to compile the comparative report. And that financial data is derived from their audited financial statements. So all of that information is required to be submitted to our office each year by December 15th. And then the CPA firm, the external auditor, also has a requirement to submit the audit results to the local governing body, local officials, by a certain due date at the end of the year. And then the local officials have a requirement to send us a notarized statement that that presentation was actually completed. So moving forward to just quickly talk about just some recent legislative updates. Again, we really try to speak to any type of legislative updates that are primarily and significantly going to impact local governments, audits, and financial reporting. Again, a lot was passed during the earlier 2023 session in Virginia's General Assembly. that impact local government, but we're not going to speak to all that. And really overall, nothing was actually fully passed during the session that impacts financial reporting or audit requirements for local government. But I did want to include, as you'll see these other 2 points on this slide, some pending legislation. And this has to do with, it is pending because it is in the Commonwealth's Appropriation Act, so the budget bill. And as many, if you are part of Virginia or a local government, that amended budget is still pending, that nothing was passed this last session. So these 2 items are still technically pending, but they will impact, whenever they're finalized, they will impact audit as well as our annual fiscal distress monitoring. So to quickly speak to the last bullet on there, and I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about that, but this has something to do with us including new audit requirements related to Virginia localities' receipt of opioid abatement funds. So I'm going to talk again, not to get to a lot of detail about what our annual audit specs are for those on the call today that are not familiar with that. So I'll kind of keep that a little bit later and speak to what this pending budgetary amendment, again, if this is passed, this will actually be language in the Commonwealth's Appropriation Act for us to add information each year to our specs. And then another item, again, it's pending because it's in the State's Appropriation Act. And this relates to adding some additional language as part of our annual monitoring process that we do. And I'm going to talk in more detail about that. So this is just kind of a highlight. And this primarily is adding some additional language to speak to bring our process a little bit more inclusive of, because the nature of our process is built on us being able to analyze audited financial statements. So without that audited financial statements, if localities are delayed, particularly for a good bit of time, there's really nothing we can do with our process as far as monitoring the data or calculating financial ratios. So the General Assembly added some language, some pending budgetary language that speaks to, primarily for our office, it directs us that if the locality has not completed its audit and submitted its, audited financial report, financial statements, has not completed those and submitted to our office within 18 months of the deadline, which is December 15th, then we send a notification to the governor and money committees. And then from there, there's some additional language where the Secretary of Finance office might get involved. And that is a completely separate, that actually comes under the executive branch of the Commonwealth. We are legislative branch. So that's something separate where the Secretary of Finance would get involved, not our office. So again, I did provide hyperlinks on this slide to where you can read all of the budgetary language that speaks to this. We're not going to go into the details of all that. The couple slides ago where I kind of outlined the overall reporting requirements for localities, just wanted to highlight a couple of more. We try to remind localities, Virginia localities, of this each year. This is a newer requirement that occurred, I believe it was passed back in 2020, 2021 timeframe. And this has to do with, again, speaking to if a locality is not able to meet the audit deadline of December 15th, that there is a provision in the state's code that speaks to a requirement of publishing a public notification on its website, as well as communicating that information to the locality's governing body, as well as to our office. And this is meant to speak to the fact that the audit is pending, it's been delayed, an overall reason for why it might be delayed. We understand that oftentimes a new system implementation may greatly impact a locality being able to meet the milestones and timeline for financial reporting. Unfortunately, I know across the board, localities, Virginia, state agencies, our office, I'm sure the firms as well as other states have been impacted by significant turnover, particularly in the finance and accounting and CPA roles. So I know that's been very impactful. We've seen that a lot on our local government level. So that might be a reason why they're not able to meet the December 15th deadline. Also, with new GASB reporting standards last year, if anyone that works in financial reporting had to implement GASB 87 for leases, that was quite the undertaking. So we understand last year that caused several delays for localities that had a lot of leases that they needed to ensure they were reporting correctly. So, legitimate reasons, obviously, things like that happen throughout the year. A lot of things often happen that are out of your control. So this is just meant to make sure that information is made public and make sure it's communicated to our office. So the next slide just kind of gives just overall some things to think about when you think about the timing of where this kind of comes into play. Obviously, it's meant to speak to the reporting deadline, not being able to meet that, which is December 15th. There is a little bit of where this provision falls. It falls within the code section that speaks to the CPA firm presenting the audit results by 12/31. So some localities have used that kind of as the trigger to, if they're not at least going to be able to be done and meet this deadline, then it will trigger their ensuring the notification is properly posted and information communicated. Some localities take a little bit more of a conservative approach, maybe do this a little bit earlier. If they know right away they're not going to meet the 12/15 deadline, maybe they need a little bit more into the January timeframe, then they'll post this notification right away. From our office's perspective, obviously more timely notification helps us. It keeps us, gives us the ability to know what localities are not going to meet the 12/15 deadline. And it helps our expectations of how that trickles down into impacting our two main projects that I'm going to talk about, which is the localities data for our comparative report, as well as we use the audited financial statements for our fiscal distress monitoring process. And then I mentioned this a little bit earlier. This is another requirement. Again, it's been in play for several years now, but we just like to remind localities about this because we do still see instances where we're not receiving these notarized statements from all localities. So just a reminder about this. This is also information we include in our annual reporting resource that we provide on our website each year as a reminder to submit this. We provide a template. It's really short and sweet. It's basically saying that the CPA firm has presented the results of the audit to the governing body, notarized, signed by the local officials, and sent to our office. There is no specific due date. This is probably the most frequently asked question we get. There is no due date or deadline for sending this in. Obviously, this can't happen until after your audit is done and your CPA firm, your external auditor, has presented the results. So oftentimes we see these statements coming in predominantly during January, which makes sense given the timing of things. So just quickly to speak to, I spoke to these other towns. We refer to them as small towns. So these are those towns that exist in Virginia that come under a 3,500 population threshold. Again, they do not have an annual audit requirement. They don't have any audit requirement, but many of them do voluntarily elect to have an audit. So within the past few years, the legislation was updated to say, if you are one of these small towns that voluntarily has an audit, send that audit report into the Auditor of Public Accounts, our office. So we provided some guidance for how small towns can send this information into us. So I've got the link there to the reporting resource. One thing we often get a lot of questions about, so we like to take the opportunity to talk about, is that also keep in mind that if you are a town in Virginia that comes under this threshold, you're not required to have an audit in accordance with auditing standards. You're not required to follow GAAP. So this allows a lot of flexibility that obviously from an overall accountability perspective, particularly for your citizens, it is good to have some sort of audit, review, agreed upon procedures, whatever it might be. And again, it doesn't have to follow AICPA auditing standards or attestation standards. It can be something very minimal, small in scope. You can do cash basis financial statements. So it's better to do something like that and have a smaller scope, maybe often more of a limited focus, which allows for potentially a smaller audit contract as far as billing purposes. But we like to highlight that the emphasis is that you're getting something done, that there is some level of accountability, and whatever the result, the reporting result is, to submit that to our office. Okay, moving into our annual audit specifications and what these are. I spoke to these earlier in the slides when we talked about the pending legislation for opioid abatement procedures. So for those on the webinar today that is not familiar with this process, part of our oversight mechanism in our office for the state of Virginia is that we publish what's called audit specifications. We've got two main documents. One covers those audits that are for cities, counties, and required towns. And then those audits that are for other local type entities that are authorities, boards, commissions, districts, those types of local entities that exist. A lot of them are regional jails, might be more regional water and sewer authorities, any of those that have a relationship with primarily local entities, although there are other Commonwealth related entities that follow these specs as well. So legislation has charged our office to create these audit specifications. And overall, again, as I mentioned, it is an oversight mechanism. Since we're not performing the audit of these entities, it's meant to ensure the quality of governmental audits, as well as ensure compliance with material and significant state laws and regulations. So oftentimes we get the question about kind of how do our specs relate to overall the external firm being required to follow generally accepted auditing standards. So the intent of our specifications is to highlight those material and significant, whether it might be related to state funding that state agencies pass down to the local level, or as the example that we'll talk about in the next couple of slides with the Opioid Abatement Authority, it might be something specific that Virginia's General Assembly has said, hey, this needs to be highlighted. We need to make sure we're getting audit coverage over this area. So it is not meant to speak to any and every state law or federal regulation or any type of regulation that a locality or local entity is required to follow. And under state legislation, those CPA firms, external auditors that are contracted to perform the local government audits, are required to follow our audit specifications during the annual audit. And we do make these publicly available on our website. I provided the link to that. So just to kind of talk more in general as it relates to our audit specs that are applicable right now for the 2023 audits that I am sure are ongoing at this point, since we are at year end and heavy into audit season. So the good thing is for the fiscal year 2023 audits, we did not make any significant changes to the existing audit procedures. No new audit procedures were added during fiscal year 23 audits. So we often do this every year. We review through what might be existing procedures. We might receive some feedback or questions throughout the prior year where we see a need to make whether it's wording updates because something has changed in a specification or regulation, or maybe just some additional clarifications to help the auditor understand what it is they should be testing. So we try to do that every year. That's generally based on feedback or things that our office might observe. We do use, since this is a Word document, we intentionally show the changes in track changes so that the local governments and CPA firms can easily see that. This year, we also did a pretty significant formatting change, and we just tried to be able to more clearly highlight those procedures, the actual audit procedures, whether they be required audit procedures, which for the most part, that's what they are, or we do have some instances where we have suggested procedures or even some risk assessment considerations that are maybe not a requirement, but suggested things for the auditor to be thinking about. So we really try to kind of show that separately, highlight that information separate from, because the specs also is very heavy in including background and explanatory information to provide some context to the audit procedures. So we did implement that this year. So, please send feedback if you have any questions or, any comments to offer on any of that formatting. We are welcome and, would love to receive that. The one thing you will see as it specifically relates to social services section in the specs has to do with, again, these are more kind of overall risk assessment type of considerations. And these came about from specifically from the Virginia Department of Social Services as it relates to some higher risk areas they communicated to our office. So we kind of highlighted these more as risk assessment considerations for the CPA firm, related primarily to IT control considerations. And that, as an auditor, if you're familiar with changes that are coming about next year as it relates to AICPA's auditing standards over risk assessment, particularly as it relates to the IT control environment. So that kind of, will pretty much go hand in hand as we implement that auditing standard for next year. And then another federal requirement related to language access plan that local DSSs should have in place. And then the last thing that we, where you'll see significant updates and clarifications is at the chapter 6, where if you are an external firm, which there are not many that this is applicable to because our office primarily does these audits of the circuit court clerks, but some clerks do contract with an external auditor. So we made some changes. My director, Lori Hicks, she is the one that oversees those audits in our office. So some changes to kind of align with what our auditors do internally for these audits to ensure consistency. Okay, we've got another polling question. So what is the required annual deadline for cities, counties, and applicable towns to submit their audited financial report and financial data, we call it transmittal data, to the Auditor of Public Accounts? So is that November 30th, December 15th, or January 31st? We'll give you guys some time to answer this poll question. So I'm looking quickly at the questions to see what I can answer. This quick question: do you have relevant guidelines and statutes for NC, North Carolina? That is no. So all of this that comes out of our office is only specific to Virginia. What is the percentage of units that do not comply? I was trying to think if I have a slide. I don't think I have a specific slide in my deck. But for last year, this past year, when we send data into, actually, I'll wait on that question because I kind of have some slides. Okay, so we've got the poll answers in, and yes, 54% got that correct. Virginia's reporting deadline for cities, counties, and required towns is December 15th. Okay, I'll come back to that question about compliance with that deadline. Does this apply to just the locality or also the school system of the locality if the school system has a separate audit? Yes, if Virginia, and there's, I want to say about 20 separate school boards that choose to issue separately issued financial statements. And if that is the case, yes, December 15th is your reporting deadline as well. Most all locality school boards roll into their applicable city and county or two towns their financial statements because they are a discrete component unit under GASB reporting guidance. Okay, I'll come back and look at a couple of these questions in the next few slides. Okay, moving forward. So the next few slides just gives kind of an overview, and I'm not going to get into a lot of the details of this today. We do have a separate training where we specifically speak to this process and what this report is. So this is just kind of meant to just give an overview, particularly considering the audience. If you're not a Virginia local government, just to give you a little bit of information about what our office and the state of Virginia does. So every year, our office is charged under this Virginia statute to publish what we call the comparative report. The long name is Comparative Report of Local Government Revenues and Expenditures. And we have a code deadline to publish at least a draft report. Whatever data we've received by February 15th, we make that available. So what this report is doing is it's intended to present the financial data for, again, it's only the counties and cities because they're required to have an audit, and then just those required towns that are required under Virginia statute to have an audit. So it doesn't include all towns. Right now, that is 37 towns that come above the 3,500 population threshold. And then, like I said, there's 2 towns that have a separate school system. So it's intended to comparatively and uniformly show their revenue and expenditure, primarily that type of financial data, in an understandable and useful manner. Right now in Virginia, it is currently the only comprehensive type of report that shows this type of local government financial data in one large report. And the key thing is that we often, if we're answering questions or reminding local governments about this, is it is built on our unique internal reporting structure that we speak to in our Uniform Financial Reporting Manual. So oftentimes, the next slide will kind of give some more detail about this. Our reporting structure will differ from GASB classifications and GASB financial reporting. And we actually provide a resource, I linked to it here on the slide, that just kind of gives an overview of how it differs. One, probably the major example, is the fact that in Virginia, as I mentioned earlier, the school boards are shown as discrete CUs of the cities and counties. So when you look at their financial statements, if you're familiar with GASB reporting, that's a whole separate discrete classification, separate column of the school board's financial information. However, when you look at our report, we don't follow that type of GASB reporting structure. That information, it's almost like the locality and school are shown as one. And, you know, through our functional expenditures and how we show information, we have an entire exhibit and an entire functional category that reports education-related expenditures and related funding. So that's just one example. There are many other examples. So that's why it's very important to follow the manual, our Uniform Financial Reporting Manual, and the reporting structure, and also why the data is submitted to our office separately in our transmittal data format because of the reporting structure it needs to follow, and again, differing from GASB or financial statements. So we do include 170 localities. So again, that's the 38 cities, 95 counties, and at this point, it is 37 towns that are required to have an audit. And we show various revenue and expenditure, different categories about that. But the primary reporting structure, as you can see on this slide, falls into 4 main categories: general government, debt service, capital projects, and enterprise. Another thing, that enterprise funds, we have specific type of activity that's considered enterprise. So just because a locality might report an enterprise fund, in their audited financial statements doesn't necessarily mean it meets our classification. So again, another example of differences there. So this just gives, like I said, this presentation is not meant to get into all the details of what our comparative report is and how that data is compiled. So just an overview from our prior year, last fiscal year 2022 report that is available on our website if anyone is interested in seeing it. At this point, the report is still missing data for 18 localities. So going back to one question that was asked, when we published our draft version by February 15th, I believe at that point it was around 40 that we had not received yet. We do include more data and a breakdown of those that don't meet the December 15th deadline, and you know, kind of the delayed and like a 30-day, 60-day, 90-day type category of delays. So I don't have the exact number in front of me. We have seen an increase in the past few years. Again, it's kind of been all over the place. Surprisingly, the year of COVID was not as significant as what we have seen in the following 2 years. But we do understand that, you know, there has still been some trickle down impact from that as far as reporting delays. And as I mentioned earlier on, you know, financial statement. I did notice one question that spoke to, you know, do we, actually, let me look at it really fast. Any discussion on moving the due date back for audits due to continued complexity? I have not heard of any discussion. That's not something that our office gets involved in because we don't pass the legislation. So another thing to clarify is that is a state deadline, so not an APA imposed deadline. So we don't have any control over that. I will say the deadline was extended. It used to be November 30th, and the year of COVID, so during 2020, applicable to 2020 audits, the General Assembly did extend the deadline to and make it a permanent deadline of December 15th. That also aligns with the state's deadline. The state's financial reporting deadline is also December 15th. So I have not heard any discussion about changing that deadline and moving it back yet again. So again, back to our report, our current report, 18 localities did not submit in time. We tried to wait as long as we could. We actually this year did not publish the final report until June, still missing 18 localities at that time. We have since received at least 5 when I put these slides together. It's possible one more locality came in and submitted their data. So we do always, iterations of the final report, we publish amended versions of the report. We'll probably try to wait maybe another month or so to at least hopefully get half of the 18 missing, possibly most all of them in, because it is an entire other process we have to go through. It's time consuming to, you know, rerun all of our exhibits and updates and also review the data prior to. So we do try to, in an amended version, wait as long as we can to receive the majority of those missing to come in. But another version will be published later. Last year, if anyone attended this webinar, this session in 2022, we did talk about, we were hoping to do a training specific to our comparative report and transmittal, but unfortunately we weren't able to do that. But we are really trying hard this year to host another training. And again, this will be very, very focused to this particular process of what a locality has to go through to prepare their financial data into the format that is needed for our comparative report. So it's very technical. It's intended for those involved in this preparation process, the transmittal and comparative report process. So we will send some information out in September. We're thinking around October timeframe, since that's when localities are going through their process of preparing this information. So, you know, be on the lookout for that. Also, please feel free to reach out to me if you want to put your name on the list, so to speak, or make sure, you know, I send information to you about this. And it will be virtual, and it's a no cost. Our office does not charge for it, especially since it's virtual. So again, we'll send some more details out, but definitely reach out to me if you're interested, and I will make sure you get information about that training. Okay, I need to speed up a little bit because I know I'm getting close to the end of our presentation. So I do have several slides that are not meant to speak in detail. These are the other entities that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, where we have a separate set of audit specifications that are related to any of these type of local related governmental entities, authorities, boards, commissions, districts, and kind of overall political subdivisions. There is a code section that requires an audit and that they follow the specs for their audit and submit the report to our office. So this slide just kind of reminds about that process. And again, we publish, if you are a local government in Virginia, you're probably very familiar with several resources that we publish all throughout the year. A lot of them are specific to your audit or your annual reporting. These are just some examples. So we are still finalizing updates to those resources that will be applicable for fiscal year 23. And we hope to get those done within the next couple of weeks. Specifically, I know that the Federal Programs Index, many localities and local governments use that to ensure proper classifications for their SIFA, their single audit, and that relates to how state agencies pass down both state funding and federal funding, so it helps to ensure you're properly classifying those revenues. This is another resource that we publish. So in the interest of time, just going to highlight some quick changes on here. Also, we have updated all year-end data. So the entire complete, an update to the slide content here is that fiscal year 23, all of the year-end data is now available, and those reports are available on our website. So two main things to highlight as it relates to the changes is that starting with July fiscal year 2024 data, we are now going to start publishing this data on a monthly basis. We used to do it on a quarterly basis. We have now been able to use some RPA processes in our office that helps us pull the data together a lot faster and get it over to me. We also have had some interest from local governments of getting this because it helps, with a more timely reconciliation if you can get this on a monthly basis. So based on when we get the data from the state, when we go through our internal review process, and by the time it gets to me, it should be around the 17th or 18th of each month, obviously, depending on, if those fall on weekends and that type of thing, when each month's data will be published, and it'll be a month behind. So for example, probably around August 18th, you can expect to see July 2023, the first month of 2024, that data be published on our website. Another thing to keep in mind, starting last year with 2023, we have expanded the query and what we internally use to pull in applicable transactions for this report. So it used to be just limited to those transactions where state agency keys a FIPS code, and that's no longer there. So you will start to see additional transactions. We've got a lot of information and notes within the report to kind of guide you on how to use the report and how you might need to look at both the vendor field as well as FIPS. So just a heads up that information is in there. We've got, like I said, notes in there to kind of help guide you along the way. This slide will give you just an overview again of, as I mentioned before, with the opioid abatement funds and where, what we're expecting this new requirement in the audit specs to come into play, as this will now relate to, as long as it's passed, will relate to fiscal year 24 audits. So this will be for next year. So this slide right here just kind of speaks to overall how opioid abatement funds impacted the Commonwealth of Virginia and cities and counties that started receiving direct allocations from the settlement agreement. So that's just kind of a recap on that. One thing to highlight on this slide as far as a change is our office is no longer going to update each year or publish that Excel lookup tool, is what we refer to it as. We will still have guidance out there for you, but now since the state's opioid abatement authority is now into play, they've got a really great website. I provided the link on there. So they are now regularly publishing any updates to the cities and counties' expected payment schedule. So our resource is now going to point to that instead of trying to have dual resources where ours might be out of date because we're not aware of changes that have happened. So we're just going to point to what is current on the opioid abatements website. So our updates to this tool should be finalized within the next week. So this next slide again gives you a little bit more information as it relates to opioid abatement funds that cities and counties have received, but as well as grant funding that will be going out to more regional programs and entities within Virginia. So again, the audit specs, the procedures will primarily speak to the opioid abatements process, their monitoring efforts, and specifically what requirements they have put on the local governments in Virginia as far as spending of the settlement funds, particularly if you have elected to receive or ask for grant funding through the opioid abatement funding or funds, you have to follow their gold standard requirements. So that is what our audit specs will speak to. So there isn't really any impact to fiscal year 23 audits that are ongoing right now. We will start to see the impact of that in next year's 2024 audits. So some additional information on there for your benefit if this is applicable to you as a Virginia local government. This is also another key thing to keep in mind. This has been a recent change where all of these resources for those Virginia local governments that participate in the Virginia retirement system, they are now available. Everything is out on the VRS's website, so the link is there. Our office has completed our examination opinions over those schedules. That information is all out there as well. One other thing too, if you are a CPA firm or a local government entity, an ABC, Authority Board Commission, please note that we did move up the reporting deadline to December 15th. It used to be December 30th. And definitely if you need a little bit more time, this is an APA deadline and you can reach out to me if you need something. But an earlier deadline by 2 weeks helps support the coverage and by your census data confirmation to our office, it supports our overall audit that we do over the VRS internally. So pushing that up a couple of weeks kind of helps more timely reporting on our end. I believe that I am technically out of time. Is that correct, Danny or Maddie?
You have up until the 2:30 Eastern to fully conclude, but at this point we're kind of getting close to where maybe you want to answer some questions or getting to the end.
Let me scroll through really fast and see if there's this next couple of slides. These are very specific to if you are an employer that participates in this in these two particular plans. So I'm not going to talk about that. But definitely, if you're a locality, a school in the teacher cost sharing, please feel free to reach out to me. I can provide some additional notes on these slides. And this is another thing, this is specific to employers participating. I do provide a link to where this information is on the VRS's website. So this is really just a reminder that this is happening as far as VRS is moving away from a single blended rate for hybrid employees, which is a whole separate plan of those that are applicable. So our next poll question kind of relates to this. The VRS will be keeping a single blended rate for hybrid employees for both the defined contribution and defined benefit. Is that true or false? So please make sure you answer the poll questions for CPE purposes. So one question that popped up, this is a great fresh question. It says, what is the biggest success of the APA that you would like to tell non-Virginia participants about? I would say kind of overall what we, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to talk about a lot today, but the slides, the information is there, and that is in our fiscal distress monitoring. And I believe that North Carolina might have a similar, depends on what states are involved on this call, because we are part of a national group. Okay, so the quick answer to this poll was the answer is false. They are moving away from the blended rate for both of those, defined contribution and defined benefit. And then this is just for interest of making sure we have all the poll questions answered. So our last poll question, which we don't get to talk about, but this is kind of intuitive. Our early warning system contains two components, a ratio analysis and a qualitative analysis. Do you think that is a true statement or a false statement? But I would say just, that was a huge process, our fiscal distress monitoring. We actually started it. And again, the General Assembly has mandated our office do that. And we started it back in 2017. And we have seen some good things come of it. We have seen a couple of localities benefit that have been struggling, that have been able to, the state has been able to provide some technical assistance to assist them. So yeah, I would say that's been a great success as far as from our office perspective and the work that we do as it relates to Virginia local governments. So I think just a couple more minutes on this question. Last poll question, please remember to answer the poll questions for CPE purposes. And this is the last one. I'm very sorry for not being able to fully get through all of the presentation. And yes, that is true.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much, Rachel. Rachel, if you wouldn't mind moving to the last slide of your slide deck, the question slide. And again, we will send out copies of the entire presentation to you all. We are going to launch a 5th polling question. We were getting some feedback that maybe you missed one of the polling questions. So I want to give you the opportunity for the to make sure you all get your CPE. And so we should be launching it now. Which session from our virtual conference resonated with you best? Feel free to select more than one. And as you're doing that and have your hand on that leave button in Zoom, I just want to say thank you again. That concludes our virtual conference. Thank you so much for joining us. We value your feedback and ask that you take part in that short survey. So if you've clicked off of the survey prior to that, if you could please answer it this time, we'd greatly appreciate it. As a reminder, CPE certificates will be sent via email within 10 days, along with copies of the presentation. You'll also be able to find them on our website. And while the conference has concluded, our assistance to you as a trusted advisor will continue. So please reach out to whoever your audit partner is, your relationship manager at Cherry Bekaert, or the presenter themselves if you'd like to discuss any of these topics further. And we truly love what we do. And our goal is to truly, fully support you in your government in any way that we can throughout, the breadth of services that Cherry Bekaert provides. Thank you again for attending our virtual conference, and have a great rest of your day and week.